So, I want to talk this morning about Etta James, and then the genesis of marriage, and then finally a math problem. So, if you don't know who Etta James is, you need to find out. So, she is a singer, and she's amazing. She's got some great songs, but one of her songs that she sings is At Last. And so, I want you to think, for those of you who are married, about when you first met your spouse. Now, sometimes when you first met your spouse, you didn't really like them. But sometimes when you first met your spouse, you thought, at last, this is the one. Sometimes it happens that way. And that's really what we see in the first reading in the book of Genesis. Adam is absolutely alone, and God recognizes that that is not a good thing. He says it is not good for man to be alone. And of course, part of the problem is he has not met his equal. He looks around at all of creation and he sees all of these different parts of creation, but none of it really speaks to him. And so when God takes part of his own flesh and blood and makes it into woman, he finally meets his match. He sees his equal. Now sometimes people take this as, since Eve was derived from Adam, that somehow there's an inferior relationship. It's not really true at all. What we see is that Adam recognizes in Eve his match, his equal, the person that he wants to spend the rest of his life with. It's that moment that God desires for married couples, that they see in the other, not just romantic love, but the possibilities. What is possible through this marriage? And that's why it's important to talk about the genesis of marriage, because marriage today is often portrayed as simply an interpersonal relationship, just something between two people. And that might be true in a civil sense. We've got a lot of attorneys and judges here today that could talk all about the civil laws relating to marriage. But what we're talking about is the sacramental understanding of marriage. And to call marriage a sacrament first means that it is more than just a personal relationship, because all sacraments are the action of Christ. All sacraments are a means of God leading us to salvation. And so when we say that marriage is a sacrament, what we're saying is God calls two people together in order that their love for each other might be a sign and a means of grace in the world, leading them and others to salvation. Now that's a mouthful. God calls two people together in order that their love for each other might be a sign and a means of the grace leading people to salvation. That's why marriage as a sacrament has to have permanence. In fact, when we talk about the essential nature of marriage, we say that marriage is permanent, faithful, and fruitful. That means that it's not a selfish love, that if it's really sacramental love, that it flows out of the two people to affect the world around them, that it touches the lives of every person that comes in contact with them. And you can kind of think about this in terms of the couples that you know. Think about the married couples you know that you love being around. Think about the married couples you know that make you feel better, that you see their love for each other and you don't feel put off by it, you don't feel excluded by it. In fact, you almost feel like the way they love each other leaves room to invite others into that circle of love. That's the fruitfulness. Sometimes it issues forth in children, but the fruitfulness of marriage means that the love of the two people flows out of them into the world around them in order to show the world a little bit about the nature of God's love. And that's why the permanence is what allows that to happen. Because the other challenge is too often we think that love is an emotion, a feeling. But we know that in marriage, love really is a choice. It's a decision. And it's a decision that has to be made over and over again. You know, we put two chairs up here in the sanctuary when we have a wedding. And the reason why we do that is because marriage, unique among all the sacraments, has a different minister. If there's a baptism, the priest or the deacon baptizes the person being baptized. If we're celebrating Mass, the priest offers the holy sacrifice of the Mass and calls down the Holy Spirit to change bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. But in marriage, the couple are the ministers of the sacrament. They stand up here in front of God and neighbor, and they, by their vows, by their promises to each other, give the sacrament to each other. They minister the sacrament of marriage to one another. And then for the rest of their lives, they continue to minister that sacrament of marriage to each other. And they choose daily to love one another. Now, it's easy for me to talk about that because I don't have to live that. I know marriage involves sacrifice. I know marriage is difficult. I know that not every marriage survives. Sometimes marriages don't last. And that's why in its pastoral mercy, the church does also call those who have experienced divorce to communion with the church. And so it's important to say that someone who experiences divorce is not excluded from the church. Someone who experiences divorce in their life is not somehow less of a Catholic. It's important for us to recognize that the church is always about redemption and reconciliation. The church is always calling everyone back to God. And so in our ministry, we need to build strong, healthy marriages. We need families to support each other in that sacrament of marriage. And we also need to be open to reconciling people who feel excluded from the life of the church. It's hard to hold both of those at the same time, but it's absolutely essential for us to be the ministry of Christ in the world. That's what leads to a math problem. You know, going back to marriage, we need to recognize that we often think that when you add 1 plus 1, you get 2. But when it comes to the nature of marriage, and you add 1 plus 1, you get 1. And that's because marriage was intended to be an image of God's love for us. It's inviting us to communion with God in such a way that we recognize that we are not just a separate individual on our own, but that we are people called to community. We are people invited to live in communion with the Lord and to recognize in our living of that communion that we are being led to salvation. And so just a final parting comment for our married couples: the way you love one another is going to get you into heaven. And so how you love each other as a married couple is absolutely critical, because it's one of the ways that God is leading you to salvation. And so I invite all of our married couples today, at some point, sit down with your spouse. Tell them one thing that you see as a fruit of your marriage. Tell them one thing that you are grateful for about God having called you together as a couple, because we need your witness in the world. We need your example of permanence, of fidelity, and of fruitfulness. And we need that because all of those things show to the world a sign of God's love.